I accidentally complimented her, and the alien woman's gaze stole my breath. The accidental admirer. The hydroponics lab on level 7 of Celestial Nexus was Dax Mercer's sanctuary. Here, among the softly humming nutrient systems and the gentle mist that fed his experimental xenoflora, he could forget that he was widely considered the most socially awkward botanist in the facility. Plants, unlike people, responded predictably to his touch. The Teravian moss orchid is showing promising adaptation to the artificial gravity, Dax murmured into his recorder, carefully adjusting the light spectrum above a shimmering blue-green specimen. Cellular regeneration has increased by 12% since... The lab door hissed open, interrupting his thoughts. Director Callan entered with a visitor who immediately commanded Dax's attention. She was unmistakably Lumarian, tall and lithe with skin that seemed to shimmer with an inner luminescence, shifting subtly between pale lavender and silver. Her movements were fluid, almost musical, as she surveyed the lab with eyes that reminded Dax of polished obsidian, entirely black but somehow reflecting countless tiny points of light. Dr. Mercer, Director Callan said, "May I present Ambassador Nira Valen of Lumaris? The ambassador has expressed interest in our xenobotanical research, particularly your work on adaptive flora." Dax fumbled with his recorder, nearly dropping it as he attempted a formal greeting gesture. Yes, welcome to the hydroponics lab, Ambassador. It's an honor to... His words faltered, as the Lumarian's gaze settled on him with gentle intensity. "Please continue your work." "Doctor," Nira said, her voice carrying a melodic quality that seemed to resonate in the air, "I find observation most illuminating." For the next hour, Dax attempted to focus on his specimens while acutely aware of the ambassador's presence. She asked occasional questions, each demonstrating surprising knowledge of botanical principles. Her questions were thoughtful, precise, and utterly distracting. "The cellular matrix you've developed for cross-species grafting is remarkable," she observed, studying a holographic representation of his latest experiment. "On Lumaris, we believe that life forms seek harmony when given the proper conditions." "That's exactly the principle I'm working with," Dax replied, momentarily forgetting his nervousness. "These plants aren't just surviving together. They're creating something new at the cellular level." A small smile curved Nira's lips as she looked at him directly. Something in her expression shifted, her eyes seeming to capture and reflect the ambient light in mesmerizing patterns. "Your eyes," Dax blurted before he could stop himself. "They're like looking into a stellar nursery where stars are born." Horror flooded him immediately. Lumarians were notoriously private about personal comments, and he'd just violated probably a dozen diplomatic protocols. But instead of offense, a look of surprise crossed Nira's face, followed by something more complex. "That is a unique observation, Dr. Mercer." The subtle luminescence of her skin brightened slightly. "On my world, to speak of another's eyes is considered quite intimate." Director Callan cleared his throat loudly. "Clearly mortified. I apologize for my inappropriate comment," Dax said quickly. "No apology needed," Nira replied softly. "Sometimes truth speaks before propriety can silence it. I find that refreshing." She tilted her head slightly. "Perhaps you might show me the bioluminescent specimens tomorrow?" "I understand they respond to emotional resonance." After she departed, Director Callan fixed Dax with an exasperated look. "Try not to cause an interspecies incident, Mercer. The Lumarian delegation is crucial to the Nexus funding renewal." But Dax barely heard him, his mind replaying that moment when Nira's eyes had seemed to see beyond his awkward exterior, finding something worthy of her interest. Perhaps, just perhaps, he hadn't made a complete fool of himself after all. At shared silences, Dax arrived early at the bioluminescent garden the next day, meticulously checking the atmospheric conditions 3 times. The garden was his finest achievement at Celestial Nexus, a harmonious ecosystem where plants from 12 different worlds created a symphony of light and color. "They respond to emotional resonance," you said. Nira's voice came from behind him, causing Dax to startle and nearly topple a delicate hanging specimen from Proxima Centauri. "Ambassador, I didn't hear you enter." Dax steadied himself against the cultivation bed. "And yes, they do. The Mirialan light ferns in particular seemed to amplify the emotional states of nearby sentients. Nira approached slowly, her movements causing gentle ripples in the air. Today, her skin held a deeper lavender hue, and she wore a simple tunic that seemed woven from materials that caught and refracted light in subtle patterns. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the central garden where the most sensitive specimens grew. "Of course." Dax stepped aside, allowing her to enter the circular arrangement of plants. "Just be aware they might," the garden responded before he could finish his warning. As Nira moved among the plants, waves of blue-green light pulsed outward from where her fingers gently touched the foliage. The Mirialan ferns arched toward her, their fronds glowing with an intensity Dax had never witnessed before. "Extraordinary," she whispered, her obsidian eyes reflecting the cascade of colors surrounding her. "They sing with light." "I've never seen them react so strongly," Dax admitted, fascinated by both the plant's response and the genuine wonder on Nira's face. "Lumerians must have a more profound emotional field than humans." Nira turned to him, a subtle smile playing at her lips. "Or perhaps they simply recognize a kindred spirit. All life seeks connection, Dr. Mercer. Please call me Dax." Dax. His name sounded different in her melodic voice. "On Lemaris, we believe that true communication often happens in silence, in the spaces between words." She gestured to the responsive plants. "Like these beings, we sense much that remains unspoken." For several minutes, they stood in companionable silence, watching the play of light and color. Dax found himself unusually comfortable in the quiet moment, despite the hammering of his heart whenever Nira's gaze met his. "Your colleagues find you puzzling," she said finally, her voice soft. "They respect your brilliance but consider you isolated." Heat rushed to Dax's face. "You've been asking about me?" "I observe. It is my nature and my training." She moved closer, close enough that he could detect a subtle fragrance like night-blooming flowers. "They do not see what I see. And what do you see?" The words escaped before Dax could contain them. Nira studied him, her expression unreadable. "Someone who speaks to plants because they listen without judgment. Someone who finds beauty in what others overlook." Her hand moved slightly, not quite touching his, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Someone who looks at my eyes and sees stellar nurseries." The bioluminescent garden flared in response, bathing them in waves of purple and gold light. "There is a reception tonight for the diplomatic contingent," Nira said, seemingly changing the subject. "Would you attend? Most find these functions tedious, but your perspective might make it bearable." Later, Dax would wonder how a simple invitation could feel so monumental, how the space between their almost touching hands could contain galaxies of unspoken possibility. "I'll be there," he promised, as the garden continued to pulse with light around them. Whispers of danger. The diplomatic reception was held in Celestial Nexus's grand observation dome, where the sweeping panorama of space served as a backdrop for the gathering of humans and aliens in formal attire. Dax tugged uncomfortably at the collar of his dress uniform, feeling conspicuously out of place among ambassadors and station officials. "You appear distressed," Nira's voice came from beside him, and Dax turned to find her dressed in a flowing garment that seemed to capture and release starlight with her every movement. Is social discomfort a universal constant, perhaps? Despite his nervousness, Dax smiled. If there's one thing that unites sentient species across the galaxy, it might be the awkwardness of formal functions. "Then we shall be awkward together," she replied with a slight inclination of her head. "Come, there are individuals you should meet." As Nira guided him through the reception, Dax noticed how other diplomats regarded her with a mixture of respect and wariness. The Lumerian reputation for inscrutable motives and telepathic abilities made many uneasy, yet Nira moved through the crowd with graceful confidence. "Ambassador Vylon," a sharp voice interrupted, as a tall human with cybernetic enhancements approached. "I see you found an interesting companion for the evening." "Under-Secretary Harlow," Nira acknowledged coolly. "Dr. Mercer's work on adaptive..." Xenoflora has significant implications for the terraforming project on Epsilon 9. Harlow's augmented eyes scanned Dax dismissively. Indeed, though I wonder why a mere botanist warrants such attention from Lumaris's senior diplomat. Before Dax could formulate a response, the lights in the observation dome flickered dramatically. A moment of darkness was followed by the harsh wail of emergency sirens. "Atmospheric containment breach detected in Section 14, announced an automated voice. "All personnel implement emergency protocols." The elegant gathering dissolved into controlled chaos as security officers moved to escort dignitaries to safety zones. Dax instinctively reached for Naira's arm, only to find her already moving toward a terminal, her fingers dancing across the interface. "Section 14 houses the primary life support systems," she said, her voice tense. "This is not a malfunction." Dax joined her at the terminal, reading the scrolling data. These patterns. Someone's manually overriding the environmental controls. If they succeed, the entire habitat ring could lose atmosphere. Without discussion, they moved in unison away from the evacuating crowd, heading instead toward a maintenance corridor. Naira's eyes had taken on a focused intensity that made the tiny lights within their darkness seem to burn brighter. "You have access to these systems?" Dax asked as they ran. "I made it my business to understand all critical systems upon arrival," she replied. A diplomatic habit born of survival instinct. They reached Section 14 to find the access hatch sealed. Through the reinforced viewport, Dax could see two figures in environmental suits working at the central control panel. "Saboteurs," Naira whispered. Her hand found his in the dimly lit corridor, her skin now pulsing with a subtle silver luminescence that betrayed her tension. "We need to override the lock." As Dax worked on the security panel, Naira leaned close, her breath warm against his ear. "Dax, if we stop this, there will be consequences. Dangerous ones. Are you certain you wish to involve yourself?" He paused, looking into her extraordinary eyes. In their depths, he saw concern, not for herself, but for him. "I'm already involved," he said simply. "Has been since I commented on your eyes." A small smile touched her lips, and for a heartbeat, the danger surrounding them seemed distant. "Then let us proceed." As the hatch began to slide open, Dax realized that, whatever lay ahead, his life had irreversibly changed the moment Naira Violin had entered his laboratory. Some connections, once formed, could never be broken, even across the gulf of different worlds. Bridges between worlds, the hatch slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and before the saboteurs could react, Naira moved with startling speed. Her hands traced patterns in the air, and a wave of disorientation seemed to ripple through the chamber. The two figures in environmental suits staggered, their movements suddenly clumsy and uncoordinated. Telepathic disruption, Dax realized aloud, watching as one saboteur collapsed to his knees. Naira nodded grimly. "A defensive technique. It won't last long." Dax rushed to the control panel, his fingers flying across the interface. "They've initiated a cascading failure in the life support algorithms. I need to isolate the affected systems before—" A bolt of energy sizzled past his ear, scorching the panel beside him. The second saboteur had recovered enough to draw a weapon. "Step away from the controls," the figure demanded, voice distorted through the suit's communication system. Naira positioned herself between Dax and the attacker. "Lower your weapon." "You cannot succeed." "The Alliance cannot allow this collaboration to continue," the saboteur replied. "Humans and Lumarians working together threatens everything we've built." A moment of understanding flashed between Dax and Naira. This wasn't random terrorism. It was targeted opposition to the very concept of their species cooperating. "Keep working," Naira murmured to Dax. "I will handle this." What followed happened so quickly that Dax could barely follow it. Naira moved like quicksilver, her form seeming to blur as she closed the distance to the armed figure. There was a brief struggle, a flash of light as the weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, and then both saboteurs lay unconscious on the floor. "How did you—" "Later," Naira interrupted, joining him at the controls. Can you stabilize the systems? Together they worked feverishly, Dax's botanical expertise unexpectedly valuable as they recalibrated the oxygen recycling protocols that had been sabotaged. When the final algorithm locked into place and the warning lights shifted from red to green, they both exhaled in relief. Security forces arrived minutes later, taking the unconscious saboteurs into custody. Director Callan followed, his expression a mixture of alarm and confusion as he looked between the botanist and the alien diplomat. "Would either of you care to explain what happened here?" he demanded. Hours later, after extensive debriefings, Dax found himself alone with Naira in a quiet corner of the station's arboretum. The artificial night cycle had begun, and the bioluminescent plants cast a soft glow over her features. "The Alliance believes that closer relations between humans and Lumarians will destabilize the current political balance," Naira explained quietly. "They are not entirely wrong. Change often brings disruption before harmony can emerge." "Is that what we're doing?" Dax asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Creating change?" Naira's gaze held his, the tiny lights in her obsidian eyes seeming to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "I was sent here to evaluate human intentions, to determine if deeper diplomatic engagement was worth the risk." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining. "I did not expect to find someone who would see beyond the differences between us." "And what have you concluded about human intentions?" Dax asked, aware of the warmth spreading from where their skin touched. "I cannot speak for all humans," she said, moving closer until he could feel the gentle heat radiating from her body. "Only for one." When their lips met, Dax felt as though he was touching starlight. Her skin glowed with increasing luminescence, and the garden around them responded, bursting into waves of color that reflected their shared emotion. "On Lumaris," Naira whispered against his lips, "this would be considered a rather significant diplomatic development." Dax smiled, his fingers gently tracing the contours of her face. "And on Earth, we might call it something simpler." "What would you call it, Dax Mercer?" "The beginning of something beautiful," he replied, as the distance between their worlds seemed to vanish entirely. Beyond stars 3 weeks after the sabotage attempt, Celestial Nexus buzzed with activity as representatives from 12 worlds gathered for the Interspecies Cooperation Summit. Security had been dramatically increased, with every corridor and chamber under constant surveillance. Dax stood before the review board, completing his presentation on adaptive xenoflora and its potential applications for worlds with damaged ecosystems. "In conclusion," he said, displaying a holographic model of interconnected plant systems, "when species from different worlds are given the proper conditions to communicate at the cellular level, they don't merely coexist, they create entirely new possibilities that neither could achieve alone." From her position in the diplomatic section, Naira watched him with undisguised pride. In the weeks since the incident, their relationship had evolved into something that had no precedent in human-Lumarian relations. They had become the living embodiment of the cooperation they hoped to foster between their peoples. After the session ended, they met in what had become their private spot, a small observation deck overlooking the stars, where the curve of a nearby nebula painted the darkness with swirls of purple and blue. "The Alliance representatives were watching you closely," Naira said, concern evident in her voice. "They still view our connection as a threat." Dax took her hands in his, marveling as always at how her skin shimmered in response to his touch. "Let them watch. We've done nothing wrong. Perhaps not by your standards." Naira's expression grew serious. "But I have received a communication from the Lumarian High Council. They are concerned about my objectivity. They believe I have become too emotionally invested in a single human to properly represent our people's interests." A cold dread settled in Dax's stomach. "They're recalling you. They are considering it." Her eyes held his, the tiny stars within them seeming dimmer than usual. "Unless I can demonstrate that what exists between us serves a greater purpose than personal fulfillment." Dax paced the small deck, his mind racing. The Botanical Integration Project. If we could show them how the principles we've discovered together could help repair the atmospheric damage on Lumaris's outer colonies. It would need to be more than theoretical, Naira said, hope kindling in her voice. We would need proof of concept, something tangible. Then let's give them something tangible. Dax's voice strengthened with conviction. Not just for Lumaris or Earth, but for all worlds struggling with environmental collapse. The next days passed in a blur of intense work. Dax and Naira barely slept, combining his botanical expertise with her unique understanding of Lumarian ecosystems. Together they created a prototype, a self-sustaining biosphere where plants from their respective worlds not only survived, but thrived together, generating atmospheric conditions that could potentially heal damaged worlds. On the final day of the summit, they presented their work to the assembled delegates, standing side by side before representatives of a dozen species. What you are witnessing, Naira explained as the holographic display showed their creation in real time, is not merely plants growing together. It is communication across biological boundaries that were once thought impermeable. The implications extend beyond terraforming, Dax continued. This represents a fundamental shift in how we understand interspecies relationships at every level, from cellular to societal. The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed the significance of what they were seeing. Then, slowly, the Lumarian High Council representative rose to her feet. Ambassador Vaillant, she said formally, the Council acknowledges the value of your collaborative approach. Your assignment at Celestial Nexus will be extended indefinitely to pursue this research. Later that night, as they stood together watching the stars, Dax felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Did you know this would happen when you first came to my lab? Naira laughed softly, the sound like chimes in the quiet space. I am a diplomat, not a prophet. I came seeking information and found... Her voice trailed off as she searched for the right word. Stellar nurseries? Dax suggested with a smile. Home, she corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. I found home in the most unexpected place. As Dax wrapped his arms around her, he marveled at how an accidental compliment had led to this moment, standing at the threshold of something that transcended both their worlds. Her luminescent skin glowed warmly against him, responding to his touch in patterns that told stories without words. There will be challenges, Naira whispered. Our worlds are very different. Then we'll build bridges, Dax replied simply. It's what we do best. Above them, the nebula shifted, its cosmic dance continuing as it had for millennia. New stars were being born in its depths, just as new possibilities were being born between their worlds. And it had all begun with a nervous botanist noticing the universe reflected in an alien woman's eyes. Beyond stars, Naira murmured, echoing a Lumarian phrase about finding connection in unlikely places. There are always new lights waiting to be discovered. Dax smiled, understanding perfectly. Some translations, after all, required no words at all.